When we talk about God in a monotheistic context, i.e., of faith in one God, it seems unnecessary to give it a specific name. The very word God is enough to indicate what or who are we talking about. But in the ancient world, in a polytheistic context where there are many gods, people needed to be more specific than that. I couldn't just say, I serve God. It was necessary to say which God or what gods the person served. And for that she needed to use specific names, right? Own names. And that's why in Finland, for example, we find people talking about God Baal, of the Dagon god, of God Chemos, and of course, of the God of Israel and Judah, or the God of intelligence, which is also called by a proper name. After all, he was initially a god among many of these gods, of a polytheistic reality. And to illustrate this better, we can get a ticket in the gallery that talks about a dispute, territorial, between two peoples, different, the Israelites and the Ammonites. In this dispute, an Israeli named Jephthah defends that the right to land was of divine origin. But he doesn't say, this land is mine because God gave me. He knows he has to be more specific than that. So what he really says is this: the land to which you, harmony, has a right is the land that the God of you, that's us, gave to you, and the land to which we Israelites have a right is the land that our God, and then he says the proper name of this God, gave it to us, and I want that name yet. Not to burn stage right, we will do this throughout the video further forward, but I can show how that name was initially written, nor, and even using the oldest archaeological record that we have that name. And that record is that object you're seeing there, which is the Moabite stone, or else which stela. This is an artifact dating from the 9th century before Christ, and is the oldest really that contains the name of the God of Israel. And statistically, this artifact was not produced by Israelites. He's actually a Moabite artifact who called for the liberation of the kingdom of Moab regarding the dominion of Israel. And what the text written on that artifact says there is that the chief god of Moab, what is Chemos, had been angry with his people in the past, and therefore give you these people into the hand of the Israelites. But sometime later, a new Moabite king named Mecha managed to regain the favor of God wants us and get rid of Israel's oppression. And more specifically, this text also says that in this military victory of Moab against the Israelites, some objects linked to the worship of the tutelary God of Israel were taken and placed at the feet of Kamasa, who was the tutelary god of Moab, and this to say, of course, the superiority of this god over the other, and in a way, also the superiority of this nation in relation to another. So it's precisely in this context, and talking about that specific part of the objects of the temple of the God of Israel, that a stela de Mecha registers. What is the name of this God? That way you're seeing it on the screen, right? Are 4 letters in a variant of the Phoenician script, which are basically equivalent to the letters Yod, Vav, E, Re of modern Hebrew writing. Again, right, this is the archaeological record. We have that name in the century before Christ, but in the following century we find other records as well, right, containing this name, like those inscriptions made in a vase found in the Sinai region. In it too we find the Yod Revav, or sometimes just Yod Revav, without the last letter. And from the 7th century onwards, we have several other occurrences, and they are already much more numerous than the 9th and 8th century, and they include up to short forms that mark the name of the God of Israel, only with Yod and a king, or with Yod and a Vav. So like this, there were several ways to record this name. But beauty, right? The writing of that name was like this, but like it was pronounced. Good here. Things start to get a little more complicated, right? There are at least 2 basic difficulties that we need to face to answer this question. The first is a methodological question. Is that all these letters right, Yod, Revav, and Re again, are delicious, as they are any other letters of the Hebrew script? At the time, vowels were not indicated in the writing, so most of the time, the person only knew how a word she saw in a written text, because she already knew that word for its use in oral language. And then by the context, she recognized what was the word that was registered there in writing, and could correctly that word. Only the problem with that is, if you lose pronunciation in oral language, if that word stops being said, you can't find out anymore just by your shape. Your written record. What was the pronunciation me? You need the pronunciation to remain by oral language, so she doesn't get lost. And what happens? And here we enter the second difficulty about this pronunciation of the name. That is a difficulty. Historical. Is that at a certain stage of development of the worship of the God of Israel and Judah, the pronunciation of this God's name began to be avoided. Originally, this wasn't like that, because we find this term being used in several documents. Various texts, is being placed even in the mouths of foreigners. For example, so even people who weren't exactly Israelite uses the name of the God of Israel in contexts, so to communicate, to talk about who they are talking about. But really, at a certain point in history, this custom of avoiding this name begins to emerge. And this can have two main factors, right? This is not entirely clear in the story, but there are two factors, main ones generally pointed out by historians. The first may have been the adoption of an interpretation, extra melius, of the commandment, "You shall not take the name of your God in vain." That may have discouraged quite the current use of this name. And the second may have been the consolidation of an understanding that divine names had certain magical powers, and that therefore shouldn't be known to anyone. Anyway, the fact is that we find rabbinic texts of the first centuries who say the divine name could only be pronounced, no Yom Kippur Day hair high priest, inside the Holy of Holies, which was the holiest space in the Temple of Jerusalem, right? I.e., a really practically absolute use of that name. And there is also a Samaritan tradition that says the name divine was only known to the high priest, who secretly passed this name on to his successor, and that of generation in generation. Then only the high Samaritan priests, who would know the name of God. And even in writing, people sees this process of predicting the use of the divine name happening mainly from the 3rd century BC. The Jews who translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek between the 3rd and 1st centuries before Christ replaced all occurrences from the proper name of the God of Israel and Judah by the words Kyrios, or Theas, i.e., Lord or God, respectively. And to this day, actually, this trend can still be seen in most provinces, who usually replace their own name with the word Lord or God, using this font a little different, right? What is verse elite? This editorial option, it is even explained in the introduction of the molecules that but do few this. People end up reading this part and realizing that there was this replacement in the new will as well. God's own name never appears. It's always Kyrios or Theos too, which correspond to the Hebrew words Adonai and Elohim, who were already experiencing the use of their own names there. So like this, since the 3rd century BC, we have this record, right? History, documentary, this practice of avoiding the use of the name of the God of Israel. Or that contrasts a lot, like I said, with what we find in most of the Hebrew Bible, right? The Old Will. Who are people using that name all the time? And even with foreigners, and even foreigners using the name, so that those texts don't give the slightest right clue that there was an intention to avoid the use of the name. But anyway, regardless of what exactly they were, the reasons that led to this trend, to avoid using the divine name, the fact is that this added to possibility to register the pronunciation of that name in writing, because of that question there of the absence of vowels, made the preservation of the oldest forms, name pronunciation, were greatly impaired. But despite this, there are still several forms known to date to this name. So for example, Yahweh and Eve, Yerui, Jehovah, Yahu. Finally, there are several pronunciations that circulate today. So the question we could ask right now is, where did people get these pronunciations from? And the answer comes mainly 2 sets of manuscripts, which are manuscripts that preserve right there, after this period of avoiding the record of the divine name, preserve this name in Hebrew and Greek. So let's start here at first. Set of manuscripts born. What is the Hebrew set? What are the Masoretic texts? The Masoretes were Jewish scribes that introduced a series of signals in Hebrew writing between them, some signs to indicate the pronunciation of vowels. So in those texts that are medieval, We have this innovation in the writing of Hebrew that makes it much easier to record the sound of words, right? The pronunciation, actually, of the words. And as in the Masoretic texts, the proper name of the God of Israel appears thousands of times. We could see how the pronunciation of that name was registered using this new notation. And when we do that right, what we find is not but several possibilities. No Codex Helena engraving, for example, which is an edition of the Hebrew Bible, writing in the Masoretic system. What we find are main ways Eve, ear, Evi, and Erovi. It's even there, which comes the Jehovah form, which is used a lot today, comes from this Jehovah. The problem is that scholars today agree with these markings. Vowels that we encounter in these examples that are on the screen should not be understood like the vowels of the divine name proper, but rather that they indicated that other words should be pronounced in the place of the divine name. The forms ye, ear, for example, would indicate that the word Adonai that has these vowels should be pronounced. Already the forms Eve and erroneous would indicate that the word kidney that has these vowels should be pronounced that right. Once again, in that spirit of avoiding the pronunciation of the name and something else right, even though the Masoretic text actually indicate the vowels of the name itself, this would be no guarantee that this or these ni, since it has different shapes. There had really been the pronunciations of the divine name forever. We know, for example, that the Masoretes in the Middle Ages vocalized the name of sister, like Miriam. But the Jews in Alexandria, who translated the Bible into Greek in times before Christ, vocalized that name differently. They said something like Mary. And we know it because they used the Greek letter alpha to register the vowel of the first syllable of that name, right? When they passed of a writing without vowel indications for writing with vowel indications, that was Greek. They used the letter alpha. That gives that sound of Mary's. So like something this, we don't have the slightest doubt about, is that the pronunciation of Hebrew in general and the pronunciation of Hebrew names in particular, including divine names, varied over time. Good, and how the Masoretic texts. So don't kill this pronunciation issue. People can try another feature, which is to see how authors who wrote in Greek in antiquity and consequently used the writing system that represented the vowels. How did they write the name of the God of Israel? And when we go to these Greek texts, once again, we find a diversity of divine name notations. In the 1st century before Christ, for example, an author called Psycholoder wrote the name of this God with the letters iota, alpha, and omega, i.e., something like Yahoo. This same spelling appears in some texts in Greek also that were found among the Dead Sea manuscripts, dating there from the 3rd to the 1st century before Christ. Later, Ireneu de Leon also wrote the name with iota, alpha, and omega, while Clement of Alexandria and Origins of Alexandria, they already used these shapes where you are seeing them on the screen. Then Person used this and Epiphanius used these. And this last form specifically used by Epiphanius. It's very interesting because she sounds like and the V, which is a pronunciation that is already very close to the form already used in some Bible words in Portuguese today. And if you want to better understand the language process, where it results in these various shapes that are appearing on the screen, then check out the interview there I did with Stevento from the Glossinalta channel. That there he details this question quite a lot, is using the expertise. His knee, after all, is a linguist, right? Polyglot, knows a lot about the history of languages and Hebrew, but for the scope of this leaner video of ours, summarize, just say the following, that all these organic forms are possible forms to interpret the 4-letter name that we find in Hebrew, right? Called tetragram, which simply means that 4 letters. That's a term the Greeks used to refer to that name. Even though they are possible ways of interpreting the name, it is important to say that they are all imperfect. Also because some sounds of the Hebrew language that cannot be represented by no foreign letter nor. So it's not a flaw here. Who is passing from one described way to another is that there really wasn't the resource of representing, for example, the rho sound right from Yahoo, for example. Then the Greek would write Yahoo because he has no way of representing that kind of var sound from Yahoo. using Greek writing. But anyway, morality of history. The then documentary Greek Testimony is also insufficient to kill the question how the name of the God of Israel was pronounced in antiquity. He gives important clues, but also does not close the question. And there to close, I just need to talk about the meaning of this name, which can also give you some interesting clues about your pronunciation. And we can start with the meaning that most people know by this name, which is what appears in the book of Exodus. In this book, water meets a God on a mountain that promises to free the Israelites, nor the people of Berlin, of the situation of slavery they lived in Egypt, and in the face of that promise, asks a question, perfectly adequate to the polytheistic environment, nor in which he lived, which is as follows. When I go to the Israelites and say, your father's God sent me to you, and ask me what your name is, right? The name of God, I will say, and the answer he receives from God is this: I am the one who is, or I am who I am, or I will be who I am. Finally, there are several alternatives. But what does it matter to us here is the presence of the verb to be. And then continuing right, God said more, thus shalt thou the Israelites, I am sent to you. Said God, still holding her. So shall the Israelites say, and bird, or however you want to it, the God of your parents, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob sent me to you, is my name forever. And this is how they will summon me from generation in generation. Well, this is the translation of the Bible of Jerusalem. As I said, there are several other possibilities. But the important thing is to understand that there's a play on words here that the text presents, or verb to be, or be right, in the form that appears there in Hebrew. In the first person is are, and I am, or I will be, or I will be. And there are these possibilities because here. There is no tense specific to the present in Hebrew. And there is also no distinction between being and being right. The context is what will define. And that same verb in the third person is insane. So a reading of that text would be that the name divine means he is or he is. Either he will be or he will be. That occurs in parallel there in the text with the I am, or would it be me? What is said before? So if this is really the idea, the pronunciation of the divine name would have to be similar enough with the pronunciation of the verb be in the third person go. And that's why this pun made sense, right? For God to say first, I am are, and then I are, and or something like that, like Yahweh is. Now it is also worth saying that not all historians believe that this story is present in the Exodus actually records the meaning. Divine name original. It is also possible that the author of this passage had from the Exodus doing what is called etymology, which is basically to a meaning for a name that people no longer remember. What did it mean before? This is very common in texts in general and very common in Australia. So like this, there are other proposals, alternatives placed by some historians, but nothing that has much solidity either. In the current state of academic research, in summary, then, the God who today is often called only God, by and simply, was historically called by a more specific name, nor a proper name, which appears for the first time in the archaeological record in the 9th century BC, and that it was pronounced all the time, given the need to specify which one is exactly your God, or your gods, in a polytheistic context. Since the 3rd century BC, at least, this God's name began to be avoided and replaced by words like Adonai Ni, Lord, or Elohim God. And this greatly compromised the appearance, the pronunciation of that name. It is possible until you try to recover that pronunciation to some extent. Considering the old records we have of him, and the semantic origin of the name too, its meaning. Right? But nothing that is absolutely definitive, nor, even because, as we saw right, certainly, that name, just like any other name, any word, of any language, had different pronunciations over time and space. International academic reconstruction, more conventional, today is something like Yahoo, or in Portuguese, Java or Java. But again, no, the history of this name cannot be reduced to these pronunciations. The truth is that over time there have been several ways of writing to understand the meaning, and to deal religiously with that name. If you want to meet more others, details of this story, then see the interview with Estavo from the Gloss channel. That there we talk more about other issues, and he also explains in much more detail the linguistic aspects of this story, and of course, graphical references also. The books and articles consulted to make this video are listed there in the video description, and there are even books in Portuguese where you can find easily. So I strongly recommend take a look there. And that's it. Thank you very much for watching. And even the next video said,